This is the biographical lens. So the author Tom Godwin was born in Maryland in 1915. He had a very rough childhood. He grew up in a lower income family that constantly had money struggles, and his mother passed away when he was just a toddler. Then he was raised by just his father, and they had a very rocky relationship, to say the least. Another tragic event that shaped his future was the death of his sister when he was only 5. She actually passed away due to an accidental gunshot wound that Tom inflicted. He was only 5, so he didn't understand the consequences of playing with weapons like that, and he accidentally pulled the trigger and she passed away. This was a major cause of his depression, and obviously a major cause of trauma like it would be. So he withdrew from school before the 3rd grade and was self-taught. He adapted his own writing style due to his unorthodox education, and we see this in many of his short stories that have sad endings and dark and depressing storylines. Another cause for his self-isolation and depression was his physical condition. He suffered from kyphosis, which is an exaggerated forward rounding of the back. It's very common, not very common, it's more common in older women, and it's actually very rare in young, healthy, otherwise men like Godwin. It's caused by the vertebrae in the back being wedge-shaped, causing a forward bend, as opposed to a cylinder shape where it would stand up straight. This is usually treatable, but Godwin's case was so severe that he was permanently stuck with this. Due to this, he was discharged from the Army only a few months after he enlisted. Here's a picture of what it will look like. It'll give a very hunchback view. This is one of the only photos of Godwin that is out there. You can't really see the hunchback here, but there's not very many pictures of him. He was a very private person and really didn't have any fame or popularity until after his death, so kind of sad. After he was discharged from the Army, he moved to a remote area in northwestern Arizona. He lives with his father. Despite their rocky relationship, he didn't have a whole lot of options. Here he wrote and made dry washers to sell. I didn't know what that was, but here's a picture of it. The one on the left is pretty similar to what he would have been building at the time. It's basically a gold sifting device that doesn't need water. It's just gravity and some sort of lever action to get gold out of dirt and sediment. The next year, he met his wife through the sale of one of his dry washers. He married her and adopted her 12-year-old stepdaughter, and then he based his 2 main characters in the Space Barbarians after them. This is probably his second most famous work behind the Code Equation. Soon after, though, his wife tragically passed away due to a heart attack. So then he lived with his adopted daughter and her family for a while in Texas. But then, due to his growing depression after his wife's death, he moved to Nevada by himself. Here, his alcohol struggles got even worse, and he died alone due to many health conditions as a result of his alcohol abuse. He was alone and had no identification on him when he died, so it took him a while to find out that it was actually him. A peer that was a physician's assistant recognized him and got his daughter to come up and confirm from Texas. So very tragic. The connection we found was one to 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. We got this connection because whatever the characters do, the end result is inevitable, and they're impacted by factors out of their control. In the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, we see that Aidan Bishop will wake up in the loop the next morning regardless of what he does. He's stuck basically and did nothing to cause his own turmoil. Similar to how the pilot and Marilyn both know her fate is sealed and she will have to get jettisoned eventually to save him and save the people on the planet. Neither want the result, but the situation is out of their control. Both stories are set in places that the characters do not fully understand. They're at the mercy of their surroundings totally. Like Aidan Bishop does not know why or how he was put in the prison game, and then Marilyn does not understand the reality of the space frontier, where humans are essentially at the mercy of nature, and they have no say in what happens. A quote from the short story that shows this is, "Her brother was on the frontier, and he would understand. He would not hate the EDS pilot for doing nothing to prevent her going. He would know that there had been nothing the pilot could do. He would understand, though the understanding would not soften the shock and pain when he learned his sister was gone." Here they basically explained that Her brother is of the frontier, so he understands the situation, understands that there's nothing that Pollock could do, and there's nothing Marilyn could do to stop it. It's just a tragic result of the story.
All right. Now we have the Marxist lens. And as y'all know, the Marxist lens is the lens that we analyze text through economic and class motivations. We look at the text to see what messages the author has left us about how the economy drives characters' decisions or class divisions drive characters' decisions. And we see plenty of that in The Cold Equations by Tom Godwin. First up, we see class division. Godwin contrasts the privileged earth with the more rugged frontier. When talking about the girl on board the ship, Godwin describes, or the narrator describes, she belonged on gentle earth, in that secure and peaceful society where she could be young and gay and laughing while the others of her kind, where life was precious and well guarded, and there was always the assurance that tomorrow would come. She belonged in that world of soft winds and a warm sun, music and moonlight and gracious manners, and not on the hard, bleak frontier. Those on the frontier struggle every day with horrible conditions that those on earth don't even know of. They don't know how good they have it, the safety they have, or anything else in the like. And so first we can see how Godwin explains how a society would work if there really was this space frontier. There would be those who sit back on the comfortable earth and enjoy the fruits of the labor, and there would be those who are working hard every day in dangerous, terrifying conditions, doing the best for themselves. Even summed up even better. On page 9, she did not know what the frontier was like. She thought in terms of safe, secure Earth. This is clearly saying Earth is safe and secure. Those on Earth are of another class. They are benefiting from the frontier, are safe themselves, while the frontier is bleak, dark, and dangerous. Next, we see how Godwin discusses economic motivations. The frontiersmen are driven to endure danger to support those at home. We can see this with the girl's brother in this first quote on page 3. The girl is speaking, and she says, "My brother has been sending money home all the time to us, my father, my mother, and me, and he paid for a special course in linguistics I was taking." This further analyzes the class divisions. Those on the frontier are struggling, while those at home get special course in linguistics. But it's also talking about those on Earth who may be in the lower class must send one of their family off to the dangerous new world in order for them to endure and do their best and work hard to support a family at home. That it provides a rationale, an economic rationale for why there are those on the frontier. It clearly states that those on the frontier are doing this for those back home. And it's a matter of economic motivation. And then our last Marxist analysis here is resource depletion. Lack of access to resources drives division and violence. So we can see this here in the intense rationing going on aboard these vessels. First off, on page 5, we have this cruiser must maintain a schedule. Life of not one person, but the lives of many depend on it. This life is so bleak and so dependent upon these supply developments that intense violence, famine, diseases would break out if the system collapsed. And so what this leads to is in our next point. The lack of access to resources and how those resources are divided drives a cutthroat environment. This is the girl talking in the second quote. "Everybody wants me dead, and I didn't do anything. I didn't hurt anyone. I only wanted to see my brother." And so what we can see here is that the girl didn't do anything. She didn't understand what she did wrong. All she did was stow away something on Earth that she even brought up would be slapped with a fine, maybe a short stint working it off. whereas on the frontier, where resources are thin, paper thin, and everyone's got somewhere to be, or people die, it leads to, unfortunately, violent ends. And as you guys have seen, well, she died, and it was due to how thin the resources of this new world were spread. No one could spare even a second to stop and help her. And that's just discussing how when resources are thin, unfortunately, the systems are brutal. And so now it's up to y'all. Do you think God intended to bring up issues of class division? Did they naturally arise from the society he lived in? And then, is the resource rationing a symptom of scientific demands or a greedy earth providing the best? All right, that's the Marxist lens. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so I had the feminist lens. So just starting off with women's role in society at the time it was written. So it was written in 1954, and in like the 1950s, women kind of primarily served as mothers and wives. So they're still kind of subservient to men. And then this was reflected in the writing of the short story since it was written by a man. And so in the story, only men had experience with the frontier and like space exploration and all that. And so you have this quote, the men of the frontier knew, but how was a girl from Earth to fully understand? So this is kind of supporting the idea that like, you know, it's like men are the ones with like, oh, the important jobs, and like they're the ones out doing stuff. And then it's like, oh, there's this girl, and it's like, oh, she just doesn't get it. And so that's kind of reflecting that idea of society at the time, that like women were lesser than men and like didn't hold the same responsibilities as they did in terms of like work and just like understanding how the world works. And so that's an idea that was shown in the text. And so here's this other quote: existence required order, and there was order. The laws of nature, irrevocable and immutable. Men could learn to use them, but men could not change them. So there's a lot of mentions of like mankind and like, you know, men could use the laws of nature. And so that just sets up this contrast with the one woman that's there, because it's like they talk about it's like an all men crew that's sent down to the planet, and all the ships are run by men. And so this is largely a reflection of society at the time, and just like this idea of like, oh, mankind and like men are the ones that do things. And so yeah, Marilyn the stowaway, the girl that he finds, she can also represent innocence in like the cruel, hard world of the frontier. And so yeah, they just mention how, and they also kind of generalize it to like people from Earth, but as far as the setting of like the ship is concerned, they kind of target just her with this, that like they just don't understand how space works. And so it's like men are really the only ones that truly get it. And so, but Marilyn is like, you know, kind of like a light in that darkness, that kind of this innocence that like, while it ultimately leads to her demise, it's also, you know, a refreshing change up in the ideologies that they experience there. And so here's this quote from when he first finds her. It was a girl. He started without speaking, his hand dropping away from the blaster in acceptance of what he saw coming like a heavy and unexpected physical blow. So yeah, so there's just this idea that like women are like, you know, different from men, obviously. And so it's like he finds her and thinks it's a guy, and he's like totally ready to just waste the person coming out. And then he's shocked when it's a girl. And so this makes him completely reconsider like everything he's thinking. And it's just, so like with the man, he was totally ready to just kill this person, not a second thought about it. And as soon as it's a woman, he starts like realizing how close he was to just killing this person. And so, yeah, just that idea really resonates with him, the main character. I forgot his name, but so yeah, that's important. And then, oh yeah, so there's this guy, John W. Campbell. There's a nice picture of him. So he was an editor who worked on like the sci-fi magazine, and he is largely credited somewhat with shaping the story, because Godwin, the author, kept sending it to him, and then Campbell would send it back. because the author was coming up with ways where Marilyn could like survive, and Campbell kind of was pushing for that ending with her dying, that tragic ending. And so some people see this as like conveying the idea of like, oh, it's about the foolishness of women and how men need to like tell them like what to do and accept the cold hard facts of life. And so I think that's definitely an interesting perspective. And I was actually surprised when I heard about this because that was not what I thought when I first read it. But I think it is very valid, and it definitely has a lot of things that just reflect thoughts and ideas at the time regarding gender. And I definitely think it is a very valid take on the story. But so I also don't. I also think, like I said on the other side, she can just represent like innocence and like how like human sacrifice and all that. And I don't think it necessarily has to apply to the gender, and that's just the way they convey it. Those other ideas, but I think it is. This is very valid, and you can definitely see it like this. But so here are the discussion questions for the feminist lens. Why did Barton, that's the main character, why did he feel so differently upon realizing that the stowaway was a girl? And then, how would the meaning of the story change if it had ended with Marilyn somehow surviving?
All right, so I will be going over the psychological lens for the cold equations. And so first of all, there is the if-then strategy, which is a planning method where people set rules to follow in a specific situation. For example, if X happens, Y will be the response. It's just a way to make sure everything is under control and procedure can be followed if anything were to occur. And so this strategy, it reduces any anxiety that can occur from unexpected things to happen in any sort of situation. But the only problem is it neglects outside factors and ethical problems within the procedure. And so in the short story, Marilyn's demise was a result of this strategy put in place by the EDS engineers. And so this source says he would, of course, do it. It was the law stated very bluntly and definitely in grim paragraph L, section 8 of interstellar regulations. Any stowaway discovered in an EDS shall be jettisoned immediately following discovery. So just the rule of their EDS was that if there is extra weight, the amount of fuel they had couldn't hold it, and so the weight would have to be removed. So the next psychological aspect is the 5 psychological stages of dying, which were made from Kubler-Ross. And so these stages include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And they're used to describe experiences of terminally ill patients before they died. But it can be related to this situation because Marilyn is sure that she's going to die and there's nothing that can be done. So the first stage is denial, which includes a rejection of reality, and it is a defense mechanism used to protect oneself from the upsetting truth. And people in this stage often cast blame on others, and it is mainly caused by a lack of understanding for why the person is going to die and why it has to be them. And so for Marilyn, she showed signs of everything listed above, and this quote says, "What did he mean? To go through with it? To jettison me? To go through with it? What did he mean? Not the way it sounded. He couldn't have. What did he mean? What did he really mean?" So obviously she is in denial and doesn't know why this is happening to her, even though she's the one who irresponsibly climbed onto the aircraft. So the next stage is anger, which is an attempt to concede and dilute the victim's reality, and oftentimes the victim blames anyone around them for their dying, and it includes a loss of temper, which is sometimes undirected and in short bursts. So for Marilyn, she didn't really get that angry, but she did cast blame on the EDS pilot and the main spaceship for her death. And this quote says, "They're waiting for you to kill me, aren't they? They want me dead, don't they? You and everybody on the cruiser want me dead, don't you?" Then the numbness broke, and her voice was that of a frightened and bewildered child. "Everyone wants me dead, and I didn't do anything. I didn't hurt anyone. I only wanted to see my brother." So she is casting blame all over the place, and she didn't think she did anything wrong. The next stage is bargaining, which is a patient's attempt to take control of their fate. And if, or it, often the attempts are either rational or way overblown. And so the victim could express it out loud or just say things internally to try to make themselves feel better or try to fix the problem on their own, and they become energized and active to try to find solutions. So Marilyn tried her best to see what could be done, but out in space there wasn't really much. So this quote says, "And it won't come back, but there might be other cruisers, mightn't there? Isn't there any hope at all that there might be someone somewhere who could do something to help me?" She was leaning forward a little in her eagerness as she waited for his answer. So she obviously tried her best to see what could be done, but her attempts were futile and she had to die. So the next stage is depression, which includes symptoms of sadness, fatigue, and helplessness that accompany knowing you're going to die. And it's the result of efforts from the first three stages that tire you out and don't get anything accomplished. And so the patient might question themselves or start to blame themselves of the horrible thing that's happening to them. And so Marilyn began this stage thinking about her family and all the pain and anguish she's going to put on the people who are close to her. And so this quote says, "It's already coming dark where he is, isn't it? There will be all the night. Whoa. There will be all the long night before him, and Mama and Daddy don't know yet that I won't ever be coming back like I promised them I would. I've caused everyone I've loved to be hurt, haven't I? I didn't want to. I didn't intend to." So she obviously didn't know what she was getting herself into and realizes that people will be hurt because of it, which makes her pretty sad. So the last stage of dying is acceptance, which is the moment where the patient or victim realizes that they are just going to die and they can't do anything about it. And so oftentimes they choose to do something like consoling their loved ones and saying goodbye to anyone around them. And so for Marilyn, she wrote a letter to her parents and talked with her brother before she died just to make herself feel better and make them feel better. So this quote says, "I understand," she said. "Some of the color had returned to her face and the lipstick no longer stood out so vividly red. There isn't enough fuel for me to stay. When I hit on the ship, I got into something I didn't know anything about, and now I have to pay for it." So she's just accepted that she has to die, and yep, sad story.
All right, next up, we will be looking at the archetypal lens. So all of the three main characters in the short story fall into one or more of the typical archetypes. Marilyn falls under two. So she falls into the innocent and tragic hero archetypes. And the EDS pilot falls under the ruler. Jerry is the caregiver. So the innocent exhibits happiness and goodness. They are often a youthful person. They're always optimistic and unknowing of the danger at hand. They're also often involved in some romance, and they take safety for granted. The tragic hero is a hero who possesses a fatal flaw or makes a fatal mistake, leading to their demise. They are meant to evoke a feeling of fear or pity in the audience, and they have a reversal of fate due to the fatal flaw. So Marilyn, the innocent. So Marilyn fits perfectly into this innocent archetype because she enters the ship as a stowaway and she's unaware of the consequences. Once she's discovered, she takes safety for granted and doesn't understand the seriousness of the issue. So the EDS pilot describes her as having a meek and guilty expression of a pup that has been caught in mischief. So this just shows that she knows she did something wrong, but she's still innocent to the severity of the punishment and the idea that she will die because of her actions. Also, she exhibits optimism at the start. She thinks that the Stardust can come back to get her, or something else will happen to keep her from her death. And then this turns into denial and then acceptance. And then Marilyn as the tragic hero. So her fatal flaw was becoming a stowaway, sneaking onto the ship. And ultimately, when she acknowledges her sacrifice to save the lives of others, I think this is when I sort of got the idea that the tragic hero archetype was meant for her. And the extreme reversal of fate was also a giveaway. So she started off going to see her brother, and because of her fatal flaw, she ended up dying in outer space. The ruler. So the ruler sets things straight, and they organize chaos. They can be controlling and serious, or stern. They're always responsible and have things under control. Additionally, they have an intense need for security and order. They strictly follow rigid policies and procedures. So the EDS pilot falls under this ruler archetype. While the EDS pilot attempted to bend the rules to best suit his and Marilyn's situation, he acknowledges that these rigid rules are rigid for a reason, that he cannot change these rules because a girl was a stowaway. So despite the strange and unheard of situation, the EDS pilot remains calm and collected on the outside. While he may be freaking out on the inside, he remains composed, and he has a procedure which he follows to deal with it. So he first contacts the Stardust to see if they can pick up Marilyn, and then he contacts the commander. And once he realized that it is futile to try to find a solution, he best helps out Marilyn by connecting her to Jerry. He strays somewhat from this archetype when he is sentimental and has a soft spot for Marilyn, and this is because the ruler is typically very rigid. Next is the caregiver. The caregiver protects and cares for family and friends. They're meant to serve others before themselves. They're always generous and nurturing. They sometimes take on a role of the servant for those who are close to them. So I thought Jerry was this caregiver, and this was because of his actions toward Marilyn, his little sister. So when Marilyn's cat died, this was one of the examples that Marilyn gave. Marilyn told the EDS pilot that he had held me in his arms and wiped away my tears and told me not to cry, that Flossie was gone for just a little while, for just long enough to get herself a new fur coat, and she would be on the foot of my bed the very next morning. So this just shows how he was always looking out for Marilyn. And once her cat did die, he went to the pet store and he threatened to kill the pet store owner if he didn't get her a new cat. So this, while not the typical caregiver who's very gentle, it does show that he cares very much about his little sister. So Jerry also put his family before himself. He took on a very dangerous job, similar to the EDS pilot, but he sends checks back to his family to support them. Now we find out that the family is not very well off, and by him putting his family in front of himself, he is taking that caregiver role. And the last example is he stayed strong for Marilyn when she needed to talk to him. When she first told him that she was a stowaway, he freaked out, and it used the word hopeless and desperate to describe his voice. But once he realized that it'd be better for her if he were to act calm, he changed immediately. He said, "Don't cry, Marilyn." And his voice was suddenly deep and infinitely gentle with all the pain held out of it. So this just shows how he was suppressing his emotions to make Marilyn feel more at ease in this difficult situation.